The restaurant The Corner Place was bustling with customers, but everything was in complete chaos. Emily, only 35 years old with a face marked by exhaustion, was desperately trying to keep calm as the situation spiraled out of control. A regular customer, who used to visit frequently during her father's management, stood up from his table, visibly annoyed. "I've been waiting for more than 20 minutes, and my order still hasn't arrived." His voice echoed through the room, drawing the attention of other customers. "Please, just a few more minutes," Emily pleaded, her face flushing with embarrassment. She glanced anxiously towards the kitchen, where the remaining few staff members were struggling to keep up. "Your order is on its way. If this is the new standard for the restaurant, I'm never coming back here again." The customer threw his napkin onto the table and stormed out, muttering harsh words as he left. Emily felt a tightness in her chest. His words echoed in her mind, never coming back again. She tried to steady her trembling hands as she picked up the phone, her nails digging into the wooden counter while dialing the bank's number. When she finally managed to speak with the manager, the news was even worse than she had feared. "Miss Emily, I'm sorry, but the bank cannot extend the payment deadline. If the debt is not settled within the next 15 days, we will proceed with foreclosure." Emily held her breath, struggling to stay calm, but it felt as though the world was crumbling around her. "Please, just one more month. I'm trying to get everything back on track." Her voice shook, like a rope about to snap. "Unfortunately, Miss Emily, the decision has already been made." The manager's response was dry and sharp like a blade. As she hung up the phone, a wave of nausea rose within her. Before she could catch her breath, she saw one of her employees, Dan, walking towards her with a somber expression. "Dan, what's wrong?" "Emily, I need to talk to you." He hesitated, looking down at the floor. "I'm really sorry, but I have to leave. I can't keep working without knowing if I'll get paid at the end of the month." It felt as if the ground had opened up beneath Emily's feet. Dan had been with her from the very beginning, and losing someone like him at this moment was more than she could bear. "Dan, please, just a little more time. Things will get better. I promise." The desperation in her voice was palpable. He shook his head slowly, his face filled with regret. "I wish I could believe that, Emily. But I have bills to pay and a family to support. I can't keep doing this." With a deep sigh, Dan took a step back. "I'm really sorry." Emily tried to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. She watched as Dan walked down the hallway and heard the door softly close behind him. He wasn't coming back. It took all her strength to walk to the storage room without collapsing. Once she was alone, she locked the door and sank to the floor, silent tears streaming down her face. "Why is everything going so wrong?" she thought, her body trembling. The smell of the boxes and ingredients mixed with the suffocating weight of the silence. At that moment, a distant memory surfaced in her mind, her father smiling behind the restaurant counter, the sound of laughter and conversations filling the place. He used to say, "There's always a way out, Em. God never leaves us alone even when we can't see the path." But now those words felt as empty as the shelves around her. "Where is that way out now, Dad?" Emily whispered, her face buried in her hands. "If God is here, why did he leave me alone? Why is everything falling apart?" She felt the weight of failure and helplessness crushing her shoulders. The sensation of drowning in a sea of unmet expectations paralyzed her. Sitting there, alone in the dark and surrounded by empty boxes, she realized that this might be rock bottom. Her crying turned into muffled sobs. Emily hugged her knees, curled up like a lost child. The image of her father faded from her mind, replaced only by fear and doubt. She felt more alone than ever before, as if the walls of the restaurant, which once housed so many happy memories, were now closing in on her, trapping her in despair. The next morning, Emily arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on her mind. It felt as though she hadn't slept at all, and maybe she really hadn't. Her eyes were swollen, and there was a dull, nagging pain at the back of her head. But she forced herself to keep moving, clinging to the routine like a lifeline amidst the turbulent sea of problems. The restaurant, now silent and empty, seemed like a somber reflection of her own soul. The echo of her footsteps on the wooden floor was a constant reminder of how this place, once so lively and full of energy, was now on the brink of collapse. Emily walked over to the tables and began rearranging the chairs. Each movement was automatic, a desperate attempt to do something, anything, that made her feel like she still had some control over the chaos in her life. As she turned to straighten the last chair, she noticed a figure sitting at a table near the window, almost invisible in the dim light of dawn. She blinked, incredulous. It was Mrs. Thompson, a lady with grey hair and a gentle expression. With her hands folded on the table, she watched Emily with a gaze that seemed to see beyond appearances. "Mrs. Thompson?" Emily's voice trembled. "The restaurant isn't open yet. Is everything all right?" The older woman smiled, and that simple gesture brought an unexpected sense of calm to the room. "I know, dear, but today I'm not here as a customer." Mrs. Thompson's voice was soft, but there was a firmness in it, as if her words carried a weight greater than expected. Emily hesitated, confused. She barely knew the lady, although Mrs. Thompson had been a regular customer during the good days of the restaurant before everything started to fall apart. Suddenly, Emily felt vulnerable and exposed. She was about to ask Mrs. Thompson to come back later, but for some reason, the words died in her throat. There was something about the woman's presence that made Emily feel that maybe in that moment she was the one who needed help. I really don't know what to do." The words slipped out of her mouth before she could stop them. Her voice was weak, almost a whisper. "Nothing I do seems to work, and I feel like I'm losing everything." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, as if she already knew what Emily was going to say. Her gaze was deep and serene, without judgment, just understanding. "Sometimes, dear, when we try to hold everything with our own hands, we end up exhausting ourselves. Have you ever heard of Matthew 6:33? Emily shook her head, confused. She knew Mrs. Thompson was a religious person, but she had no idea what that verse meant, and at that moment, everything felt so distant and unimportant. "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." Mrs. Thompson recited the verse slowly, letting each word sink in. When we go through difficult times, it's easy to forget where our focus should be. You're trying to solve everything with your own strength, Emily, but maybe you're carrying the burden the wrong way. Emily felt a mix of anger and sadness. Mrs. Thompson was right. She was trying to carry everything on her own. But how could she not? This was the restaurant her father had built with so much effort. She couldn't just let everything fall apart and hope for some miracle to happen. But at the same time, what else could she do? Her hands were shaking from physical and emotional exhaustion. "So what do I do then?" Emily asked, tears beginning to form again. "Praying isn't going to pay the bills or bring the customers back, is it?" Mrs. Thompson smiled gently, as if she had expected that response. "Trusting in God doesn't mean not acting. It means acting with wisdom and faith. Sometimes we're holding onto a bucket of water so tightly, trying not to spill it, that we forget to ask if that's even the bucket we need to be carrying. Letting go isn't weakness, it's wisdom." Emily blinked, absorbing the words but still not knowing how to apply them. I just don't want to fail my father's legacy." The older woman reached out and held Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. "Your father would be proud to see how much you fought, but maybe he would prefer for you to seek peace, instead of wearing yourself out trying to save something that was never meant to be the most important thing on its own." Mrs. Thompson paused. "Sometimes God allows our plans to fail to show us a different path. You need to learn to seek the kingdom of God first. Let go of the burden a little and trust. The peace you're looking for isn't in the result, but in the journey." The words struck deep, as if something had broken inside Emily. She felt a sudden urge to believe, even if just for a moment. "I just don't know how," she murmured softly, more to herself than to Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson stood up, giving Emily's hand a gentle pat. Sometimes the first step is admitting that. Remember, you were never alone. You just need to let God lead from now on. With one last encouraging smile, Mrs. Thompson walked out of the restaurant, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts and a small seed of hope planted in her heart. That night, after Mrs. Thompson left, Emily stayed at the restaurant for a long time, lost in thought. The woman's words echoed in her mind like a persistent whisper. Letting go isn't weakness, it's wisdom. She wanted to believe that, but she didn't know how. How could she let go of the fear and guilt that consumed her? How could she trust in something that felt so distant and yet so necessary? She looked around. The restaurant, which had once been the pride of the family, now seemed empty and lifeless. Stacked chairs, dimmed lights, and silence. Everything made the pain of loss even more palpable. Emily walked into the kitchen, where the familiar aroma of spices that used to bring comfort now felt heavy with sadness and disappointment. Then she felt an inexplicable urge to do something different. Without fully understanding why, she knelt in the middle of the kitchen. The cold tile floor sent a shiver through her body, but she stayed there, eyes closed, breathing deeply. "God," she began, her voice weak and hesitant, "I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to let go, but if you're really there, and if what Mrs. Thompson said is true, then show me. Show me what to do. I just want this to end." She paused, feeling a tear roll down her cheek. "Please, God, help me trust, because I really don't know how to go on alone anymore." The silence that followed felt endless, as if even the walls were holding their breath with her. Emily waited for some kind of response, a sign, anything to show that her words had been heard. But the kitchen remained still and quiet, with no hint that God was there. Yet, something inside her felt different. Not a dramatic change, but a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of relief, as if for a brief moment, the weight she carried had become a little more bearable. Emily took a deep breath, stood up, wiped away her tears, and went home, not knowing if it had made any difference at all, but for some reason she felt that she needed to try something new. The next day, she returned to the restaurant, still unsure of what to do, but determined to act differently. Remembering Mrs. Thompson's words, she began delegating small tasks to the employees, even though her mind screamed to maintain control. She asked each of them to suggest an idea to improve the service, and for the first time she stopped to listen to what they had to say. Mike, a waiter who had been considering quitting, was the first to speak up. He suggested rearranging the table layout to optimize service. Emily hesitated, but agreed to give it a try. Lizzie, the kitchen assistant, mentioned the possibility of adding new dishes to the menu to attract more customers. Emily, with a mix of surprise and apprehension, accepted the suggestion and asked the team to work on some new recipes. In the following days, small signs of change began to appear. The staff seemed more motivated, and Emily noticed that the atmosphere in the restaurant felt different, lighter, less tense. An old customer, who hadn't visited in months, walked into the restaurant, and to Emily's surprise commented on how much he had missed the place. "You know, I used to come here with my wife," he said as he sat down. "I missed this place. I hope you can get through this tough time." Emily felt an unexpected wave of emotion rise within her. Even though the financial problem was still a reality, for the first time in months, she realized that maybe things could really change. It was a small spark, but enough to keep her trying. One afternoon, while opening an old drawer in the office, she found a note her father had left for her. The words were simple but carried a deep meaning. "Seek peace in the midst of chaos. It is the true treasure." She held the paper against her chest, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't the solution to all her problems, but it was enough to take one more step. And in that moment, Emily understood that sometimes the miracle isn't about solving everything at once, but about finding the strength to take a small step, one day at a time. The days that followed brought small improvements, but also an increasing sense of anxiety for Emily. The restaurant seemed more alive, with some old customers returning and the staff more engaged, but the financial problems hadn't gone away. Each phone call from the bank or a supplier was a constant reminder that time was running out. Then one day, as Emily was reorganizing the files in her office, the phone rang once again. The display showed the bank's number. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she answered, trying to sound confident. "Hello? Miss Emily, this is Mr. Harper from Central Bank." The manager's voice was formal and curt. I regret to inform you, but after reviewing your business's credit situation, we have decided that there is no further possibility of extending the deadline. Foreclosure proceedings will begin in 72 hours. The world around Emily seemed to dissolve into a blur. Her heart raced, and the phone nearly slipped from her sweaty hand. "No, please, Mr. Harper, just a little more time." Her voice faltered, betraying the desperation she tried to hide. "Things are starting to get better. I just need a few more weeks." "I truly apologize, ma'am, but the decision has already been made." The manager's tone was impersonal, as if he were merely following a protocol. Emily tried to reason, to beg, but it was no use. The call ended, and she stood there, clutching the phone as if that could somehow change what she had just heard. Foreclosure meant losing the restaurant. It meant that everything she had fought so hard to keep alive would be destroyed in a matter of days. She stumbled out of the office, dazed, and walked into the kitchen. The space that had once been synonymous with creativity and comfort now felt suffocating. Before she realized it, tears were streaming down her face, and her breathing became erratic. "Lord," she murmured, her voice breaking, "I trusted you, but it seems like everything is just getting worse. If you really have something planned for me, if I'm truly not alone, show me a sign, because I feel like I'm losing everything." The sobs overtook her body, shaking her from the inside out. Emily sank to the floor, her legs unable to support her. And it was there, in that moment of complete helplessness, that everything seemed to crumble completely. Before she could compose herself, she heard a loud crack, a sound that shouldn't have been there. Water began to spread across the kitchen floor, flooding everything. The plumbing had burst, another problem she had no means to fix. "Is this it?" she shouted, the despair pouring out. "Is this how it all ends?" Emily remained there, sitting on the wet floor, with the water mingling with her tears. It felt as if the universe were conspiring against her. She sensed the last spark of hope begin to flicker out. But at that exact moment, the kitchen door creaked open. Emily looked up, still in tears, and saw a man standing there. He had a calm and gentle look in his eyes. "Sorry to intrude." He raised his hands in an apologetic gesture. "My name is John Miller. I heard about the restaurant and wanted to check it out. Would it be possible for us to talk?" Emily blinked, trying to process what was happening. Talk? This was, without a doubt, the worst possible moment for that. But there was something in John's eyes that made her pause. I'm not sure now is a good time," she murmured, her voice hoarse from crying. John gave her a soft smile. "I understand. But I promise that what I have to say could make a difference. I went through something similar myself, you know. I thought I was going to lose everything and was ready to give up when someone believed in me." Emily felt her heart begin to race. A part of her wanted to tell him to leave, but there was something about his sincerity, the calmness in his voice, that made her stay. Maybe, just maybe, this was the answer she had prayed for. Emily was still sitting on the wet kitchen floor, her tears mixing with the water that continued to spread. The man, John Miller, remained at the entrance, not in a hurry, simply watching her with an understanding gaze. Taking a deep breath, Emily finally stood up, her legs trembling, and tried to pull herself together. What else could happen? She was already at rock bottom. Maybe listening to that stranger was all she had left. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low and hoarse. John took a step into the kitchen and approached slowly, as if respecting her space. He glanced around, noticing the damage, but his expression remained calm. "I heard about the corner place from an old customer. He told me that this place used to be one of the best in town, and how things changed after you took over. But do you know what he said that struck me the most?" John paused, and when Emily shook her head, he continued. "He said he's never known anyone who worked as hard as you, that despite everything falling apart, you never gave up. It reminded me a lot of myself a few years ago." Emily frowned, trying to understand where he was going with this. "And what happened to you, Saul?" she asked, hesitant. "I owned a small tech company. When everything started to go wrong, I fought tooth and nail to keep the business running, but I ended up losing everything. I was devastated, thinking I was a complete failure. That's when someone believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself anymore. John smiled gently. With that support, I was able to rebuild, and today I want to pay it forward by helping others. Your restaurant story really touched me. I know what it's like to be on the brink of collapse and desperately hoping for a miracle. Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her heart raced, a mixture of hope and disbelief taking hold of her. And how do you think you can help me? The question came out as a whisper. John extended his hand, as if offering her a fresh start. I would like to invest in your restaurant, pay off the debts, renovate the space, modernize the menu, whatever it takes to help the corner place get back on its feet and thrive again. All I ask is that you don't give up, that you keep doing what you do best. Emily was stunned. This couldn't be real. It was exactly what she had been praying for. But why would anyone do this for her? Why? She whispered, unable to hold back the tears. Why do you want to do this for me? John took a deep breath, and the sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable. Because when I needed it, someone did the same for me. Sometimes, we are the miracle someone else is waiting for, and I believe in you, Emily. She looked at him, unsure of what to say. Everything she had fought for, everything she had prayed for, seemed to be materializing in an unexpected way. A warmth filled her chest, and she remembered Mrs. Thompson's words. Sometimes God lets our plans fail to show us a different path. Finally, Emily took a deep breath and extended her hand to John. I don't know how to thank you, but I'm going to make this work. I'll rebuild the corner place, no matter what it takes. Months later, the restaurant was completely transformed. The renovation had given the space a new sparkle, and the revamped menu attracted both old and new customers. On the day of the grand reopening, Emily looked around, seeing the tables filled, laughter echoing, and the sound of dishes being served. It was as if the corner place had come back to life. Mrs. Thompson was among the guests, and when their eyes met, the older woman nodded with a proud smile. Emily felt a lump in her throat and decided it was time to share her story. I want to thank everyone for being here today, she began, her voice thick with emotion. This place means so much to me and my family. It was my father's dream, and when I thought I would lose everything, I learned the biggest lesson of my life. Sometimes we need to trust that God is working even when we can't see the way. She paused, looking at each face in the room. I realized that the true miracle wasn't saving the restaurant. It was finding peace in the midst of chaos. When I let go of control, God brought the answers from where I least expected. The prosperity we see here is just a reflection of the inner peace I found. The room erupted into applause. Emily looked at Mrs. Thompson and then at John, who smiled and nodded. She ended her speech with a phrase she knew would leave a lasting impact. If anyone here has ever felt alone or on the verge of giving up, know that there is hope. Seek peace and believe that you were never alone. I learned that the hard way, but it was the most valuable lesson of my life. Emily stepped down from the small stage and walked over to Mrs. Thompson. The two embraced, and Emily whispered, "Thank you for showing me I was never alone." Mrs. Thompson smiled.